Hi everyone, welcome to A&P 242. This is Professor Ryan and we're going to go over the digestive system. So if you're watching this video as part of the class, my strong recommendation is to have your printed PowerPoints in front of you because as we go along, you're going to notice the PowerPoint files have fill in the blanks in them. So if you're filling in those blanks as you're watching the video, I think that's a great study strategy to follow along. In addition to that, on a few slides throughout the lecture, I have a tag called self-study. And that's because it's as some part of the lecture we've already, or lab, we've already gone over this material and I'd like you to go over that yourself. So let's begin. In this lecture, we are going to talk about the anatomy, very briefly about the digestive tract. We are going to go over how foods are broken down and where the accessory structures come into play here, how foods are absorbed. So the first step in digestive physiology is that whatever you're ingesting or eating is broken down into their smaller macromolecules and nutrients. And step two is that these molecules or nutrients are then absorbed into your bloodstream. And then the final step, whatever is not absorbed into your bloodstream is excreted and is considered a waste. So the digestive system has two sets of organs. One is the digestive tract, which is basically the tube that the food goes through. So if you were to trace this tube, so imagine that we are a tube that begins at your mouth and ends at the anus, and we have a body around it, right? We're a walking tube. So this tube, if you trace the track of food from the point of ingestion onwards, we introduce food or edible materials into our oral cavity. And from there, it goes into our throat, which is the pharynx. From the pharynx, we get a reflex to swallow. And from the pharynx, it goes down a tube that passes through your thoracic cavity. So this tube goes from the back of the throat and connects the throat to the stomach. And this tube is called the esophagus. From the esophagus, now we're not gonna call this stuff that is chewed up and has saliva mixed in it, it's gone through our throat and esophagus. We're no longer gonna call this food, but we're gonna call it bolus. So bolus gets dumped into the stomach, which is essentially a muscular sac. We're going to go over the histology of the stomach here in a little bit. And from there, it goes into your small intestine, which has three components to it. And then it goes through your large intestine, also known as the colon. And from there, the wastes are removed through the rectal canal and out through the anus. However, the digestive tract has help from organs called the accessory organs. Now, accessory organs are organs of your digestive system, but these are not structures through which food, bolus, or chyme. So once stuff goes through the stomach, we're not going to call it bolus anymore. We're going to call it chyme. So accessory organs are structures that help with digestion. They're essential parts of digestion, but just that food, bolus, and chyme do not pass directly through them. So these are structures that help either physical digestion, such as teeth that help grind, crush, tear different food materials, the tongue that helps the mixing of stuff in your oral cavity, or glands like salivary glands, pancreas, liver, and the gallbladder. So these are organs that secrete materials like enzymes and bile and other substances that help break down materials in your food. It's just that the chyme, bolus, and food never pass through them. So you have the digestive or the gastrointestinal tract, also known as the alimentary canal or gastro-GI tract, and then you have the accessory organs. So in this diagram, we're going to look at the overview, the bird's eye view of the anatomy of the alimentary canal or the GI tract and the different accessory structures and their positioning within the body. So the oral cavity here is located anterior side of your face, and it begins with your lips. So as your lips open, if you remember the orbicularis oris muscle and our buccinator, our risorius, our levator labii superioris, depressor labii inferioris, all of those help us open our mouth different ways. And once the lips open up, the jaw moves down, you are now starting to see in the oral cavity itself. So the oral cavity is the space inside your mouth. So from your lips all the way down to your throat. And we're going to go into a little bit more detail here in just a little bit. From there, you're going to go into your throat area, which is essentially the back of your mouth and the throat area through the superior portion of the neck. From there, you have this connecting tube that's going to go down through your thoracic cavity, which is the esophagus right here. And it's going to dump bolus into this muscular sac right here, which is your stomach. From the stomach, you open up into the proximal side of the small intestine. And the small intestine is actually the longest part of this gastrointestinal tube. It's split into 3 divisions, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. So this is the most convoluted part of the alimentary canal or the gastrointestinal tract is your small intestine. The small intestine in your lower right quadrant of the abdominal cavity opens up into the colon or the large intestine here in this particular area. So this part of the colon or the large intestine is where the small intestine connects with the large intestine. And then you have the large intestine comprising of the ascending segment, the transverse segment, the descending segment. Then comes a little S bend in your lower left quadrant. And from there you have the rectum or the rectal canal. And finally you have the distal opening of this tube, which is the anal opening. Now the accessory organs are scattered throughout various regions in the body, beginning from your cheeks, which have one of the 3 salivary glands. We're going to look at salivary glands and their anatomy, mostly during lab. But the salivary glands are secreting something called saliva, which has enzymes. So initial chemical digestion of anything that you are going to ingest is actually starting in your oral cavity. The next accessory structure is quite large and located in your upper right quadrant. And this is a large organ, which is your liver. And squished underneath the liver is this really small sac that stores bile. It's got like a greenish yellow discoloration to it, as you will notice on the cadaver when we go into the cadaver lab, and that is called the gallbladder. And then hidden here, posterior to your stomach, is a structure that's kind of tubular a little bit, and it's called a pancreas. And pancreas is both an exocrine and an endocrine structure, which we're going to talk about a little bit later here. So the process of digestion first involves something known as ingestion. To ingest something is to introduce this material into your oral cavity, and to masticate means to chew the food. So your teeth are basically starting the process of mechanically breaking foods down, which is your incisors, which are towards the medial side on both your maxilla and your mandible, which are helping you tear different types of foods, your canines, which are helping you puncture different types of foods, and your premolars and molars that are helping you grind different foods down. To add to that, you have saliva being dumped into this cavity, and it's starting off the process of chemical or enzymatic digestion. So here, ingestion is to introduce food into the oral cavity, and to masticate or mastication is the process of chewing stuff down. Now, at any point in this tube, which is your gastrointestinal tube or alimentary canal, the idea is to prevent stagnation, which is why we need propulsion. So propulsion is to move food down the gastrointestinal tract from the proximal end to the distal end. And there are times when it backs up, but in order to prevent this backing up, we have valves in different segments of your GI tract that prevent backflow. So basically, as we are propelling food, bolus, and chyme down the GI tract, we are propelling the substance from the proximal end to the distal end. In addition to keeping things moving proximal to distal, we also need to churn or mix this food. So mixing is essentially the movement of food back and forth. So if you imagine a churning or a cement mixer type movement where it rotates and mixes and churns material so that the digestive juices are mixing with whatever it is you have ingested. And this is more relevant to the stomach, that which we are going to talk about a little bit later. So to propel your bolus, which is everything, once saliva has mixed with it and you're ready to swallow, we're no longer calling this food. We're going to call it bolus. So swallowing, also known as deglutition, moves food or liquid called bolus from your oral cavity into the pharynx, which is the throat. And from the pharynx, it is going to go into your esophagus. Now, once it's down the esophagus and it goes down the stomach and exits the stomach, we have movements called peristalsis. So peristalsis is basically rhythmic movement of smooth muscle. So this is involuntary muscle around your gastrointestinal tract that contracts and relax rhythmically in order to create a forward propulsion. So peristalsis involves first a wave of circular smooth muscle relaxation. So first, when the smooth circular muscle relaxes, it moves food forward one step. So it moves bolus or chyme forward. Then this circular smooth muscle contracts and it propels. So it squeezes, moves stuff forward. Then it relaxes and allows the stuff to move ahead. So we're going to see that here in the next slide. Whoops. So let's continue. Once we have talked about propulsion, the next part is secretion. Now, this digestive system requires lubrication in order to keep things propelled. And that comes in the form of mucus. You guys already know the cells that secrete mucus and that are located all over this digestive or gastrointestinal tract. We're going to have water that helps with digestion, and we're going to see tons of enzymes such as salivary amylase, lipase, pancreatic enzymes, and such as we go through this chapter. So digestion itself is both mechanical, using teeth to cut, puncture, and grind, as well as chemical. So in terms of chemical digestion, we are specifically talking about a larger molecule breaking down into smaller components. So this process, if you recall from your Bio 160 class, so if we're talking about a protein, the breakdown of a protein to smaller amino acids is what chemical digestion is. The breakdown of a polysaccharide or complex sugar into monosaccharides is another example of chemical digestion. And enzymes that do this are essentially hydrolyzing these larger molecules into their smaller component molecules. For step number 5, absorption is movement of the movement of nutrients from like proteins, amino acids, monosaccharides, monoglycerides into blood or lymph. And finally, we are removing waste products that are undigested or unabsorbed from the body through a process of excretion or defecation. So to defecate or excrete means to eliminate unabsorbed waste products out of your system. So if you understand the story of the diagram, you're understanding how peristalsis works. So let's look at diagram number 1, and then later we can look at diagram number 2. So this tube represents, and this is the direction of movement. So this here is proximal, and this here is distal. So in a peristalsis, there is first a wave of relaxation. So when the muscles, the circular muscles engulfing this tube are relaxed, this tube sort of widens, as you can see. And when this tube is widened, the bolus is passing actively through there. Now, once the circular muscles squeeze or contract, as you see right here, the bolus is propelled. So when it squeezes, it's propelled forward in this direction. So these contractions are segmental. So at any given point, you have some areas of the tube that are contracting and squeezing right here, and you can see right here. And then there are some areas of the tube that are widened due to circular muscle relaxation. So what this entails is that bolus is not propelling as one large lump sum or as one large ball, but instead it is being broken down and distributed or sort of scattered or spread apart, so it becomes diluted. So it's not just that one area of the tube is squeezing at a time. Segmentation is to take a larger aggregate of bolus and is to spread it apart in the hopes of diluting it. Now this image is from a textbook and I have marked it as self-study. So what I would like you to do is to either draw a flowchart and go over all of the functions that are in the boxes in detail. So this is essentially like a table that gives you a recap of the different functions that of each segment within this gastrointestinal tract. Now I want to spend a little bit of time on this diagram. This is an illustration. It is a cross section and we are looking through the barrel or the lumen of the digestive tract here and talking about the components of the walls of this digestive tract itself. So this digestive tract, we're first going to start from the lumen. If you recall from ANP 1, you first start looking for a lumen, right? Wherever you have a lumen, and this from mouth to anus is a mucosal surface because it has indirect exterior openings both at their proximal and distal ends. So the black X here represents the lumen, and as you can see, this is a lumen that has multiple folds. It has grooves and indents and folds in order to increase the surface area. Over here, there is a gland represented, and here you can see the opening of a gland as well. Now, this could be a gland from the stomach, it could be glands from your pancreas and liver opening in here, or the glands of your small intestine itself. So the first sort of layer of the wall of your whole gastrointestinal tract is mucosa. And it is represented here in this initial circle right here. So mucosa, in order to see what mucosa is, you first start at the lumen, and wherever you have a lumen, you have a free space. And wherever you have a free space, you are going to have an epithelium of some sort. Now, in anatomy and physiology, structure follows function. So depending on what the function of that segment of the tube is, you are going to see different types of epithelia. And as we go through the detailed histology of each section, we will be talking about what kind of epithelium you're going to see in various segments. But every part of the tube is going to have a lumen. Every part of the tube is also going to have epithelium lining the lumen. Now, the next part of this mucosa layer involves lamina propria. Now, lamina propria here is this yellow stuff. So let me shade it with another. So this is this stuff right here. So you have the basement membrane of the epithelium, and past that comes the lamina propria. A lamina propria is an area that usually has areolar connective tissue. So if you recall areolar connective tissue, it is sort of a filler material. It supports the tube. It has all three kinds of protein fibers. So you're going to see collagen fibers, elastic fibers, and reticular fibers pass through here. Fibroblasts are going to live here as well. So lamina propria consists of areolar connective tissue. And then this red layer here that you're seeing as part of your mucosa is a very, very slender, smooth muscle. And this smooth muscle is called the muscularis mucosae. Now, the job of the muscularis mucosae is to basically squeeze the mucus out of the goblet cells. Remember here that if this is a mucosal surface, you're going to have tons of goblet cells scattered all through the epithelium. And the job of the muscularis mucosae is to squeeze the goblet cells so that the mucus can be secreted into the lumen itself. So this first wall of the tube that we have seen is mucosa. Now the second part, or the second sort of layer of this wall, is this gray layer right here. Now this goes by the name submucosa. And submucosa is where you are going to notice more glands, as well as two very important structures. Now, in Unit 4 of A&P 1, we did talk about the enteric nervous system. So in the enteric nervous system is basically the branch of the nervous system that innervates and regulates the entire digestive system. And this is, so when we talked about your autonomic nervous system, we talked about sympathetic being fight or flight or freeze. And then we talked about the parasympathetic system being the rest and digest. So the enteric nervous system, which regulates, innervates your GI system, is part of, so stimulating this is a parasympathetic or rest and digest response. And part of your enteric nervous system, more specifically the submucosal plexus, you can see all these yellow nerves or nerve endings here that hug the submucosa. They are part of the enteric nervous system, and they live right here in the submucosal layer. In addition to these, you also see blood capillaries. So this is the part of the wall that is vascularized. These red and blue dots that you're seeing here are blood capillaries. So submucosa is innervated and it is vascularized. Next layer is a strong muscular layer. And the muscular layer involves two separate muscles. So let me change the color here to red. And there are two separate layers within the muscularis. So this is layer 1 that I'm shading on right now. That is the inner, the deeper or the circular layer of muscles, and it hugs the entire tube at its periphery. And then the outer layer of muscles is the longitudinal layer, which I'm drawing on right now over here. So muscularis has two layers of muscles. These are smooth muscles, they are involuntary muscles. Now, part of the enteric nervous system that innervates your muscularis layer is the myenteric plexus. So you will notice that the muscularis layer also has these yellow nerve endings that you are noticing right here. Now, the sort of sealant or packing material on the periphery or superficial to the muscularis is your serosa. So you're seeing this is kind of like the fascia that you see in muscles. So it is a connective tissue layer that mostly has dense, irregular connective tissue. As you can see, it can be vascularized, it can be innervated, and eventually it has another sort of fibrous material called a mesentery that we will talk about in lab. So to recap, this entire tube's wall is split into 4 layers. You have the mucosa, which is the deepest, lining the lumen. You have the submucosa, which is the second here, which is denoted in gray. It is vascularized, and the submucosal plexus surrounds it. You have the muscularis layer here that has 2 layers, the circular muscle and the longitudinal muscle, and the serosa, which is basically the sort of packaging or the connective tissue layer. So this is the part that we already talked about. So mucosa has 4 layers consisting of the epithelial layer, which in the mouth is stratified, squamous, non-keratinized epithelium in the mouth, because structure follows function. It's also stratified, squamous, non-keratinized in the oropharynx, esophagus, anal canal, and it varies essentially. It is columnar, it is pseudostratified in some places as well along the gastrointestinal tract. The lamina propria is the second layer, and it is vascularized and innervated. The submucosal plexus lives here, and its composition is areolar connective tissue. Muscularis mucosae is a smooth muscle, and it squeezes mucus out of the goblet cells as well. In some areas, which is the small intestine, there are certain additional indentations within the lamina propria that we will talk about as we go through this chapter. Now, the submucosal layer, it is quite thick and made up of connective tissue. The submucosal plexus is also called the Meissner plexus. And it has a network of neurons and glial cells. So it has neurons of the enteric nervous system, and it has glial cells that control secretions of enzymes into, or secretions of the intestinal gland into the lumen. Now, one interesting detail to note here is that the esophagus and the stomach lack the submucosal plexus. The submucosal plexus is seen in all other areas except the stomach and esophagus.